Good morning. How is everyone? So this is just a little video here to go over the midterm exam, to go over its format, and to go over the specific questions on the exam. One important note, people have sent me some emails. I'm going to be getting back to people shortly. I hope everybody is well. I know this is it's a very unusual time. For some people, it's not affecting your lives too drastically in terms of negative consequences. It affects everybody differently. I hope everybody's healthy and doing well. And I'm going to just make a couple notes. So some people have emailed me about just personal issues. They've got issues because of this situation or life issues in general that have meant that they have not been able to meet every last deadline. So I am myself in the process of getting things set up as lessons go forward and weeks go forward, because there's new content that I have to create every week, and I have my own snags with that. So I am in general just being flexible with timelines. So that's just a given. And I think the biggest thing with flexibility, if I'm not demanding that it's done strictly on the day that I'm still providing deadline dates, right? I think the big issue is just staying on top of things as we get toward now the crunch time of the semester with all your other classes that you've got big assignments for, and so on and so forth, big projects. You want to be able to pace yourself and not have everything crammed toward the end of the semester, because as we all know, that just leads to more anxiety, and then the quality of your work always just kind of is going to go down because of that. So little things here and there. If you need an extra day to do something, basically you've got it. But if you have some type of bigger issue that's going to be a greater delay in getting things done, or a bigger issue that's going to affect you for the rest of the semester, definitely please email me and I will be getting back to you ASAP. For the exam, it is due this Sunday, the 19th at 11:59 p.m. at the end of the night on Turnitin, which I will turn to in just a moment. That deadline is basically absolute unless you have some type of absolute real concern that's immediate. And if you have a real concern about getting the exam done on time, it's got to be something you can explain to me in clear detail and have a justification for, and then we can talk about giving you a schedule to push that back a day or whatever it is you need. But that means you need to get in touch with me about that. Something like that means you have to get in touch with me ASAP about it. Right? Okay. So a couple important things before we look at the format here on Blackboard and then the midterm itself. The first is that I am going to continue to put up materials connected with the exam today. So keep looking for materials for it. And so the big thing is that the substance of the exam is going to come from obviously the book itself, videos, but you also have a study guide with key terms and concepts that I've been talking about, and that and then the last one is the PowerPoints. And a lot of those concepts are really spelled out in great detail in the PowerPoints. And the more you can bring those concepts to bear on the text, I think, first of all, the more you understand what's really going on. But also that's going to make for a better exam, that you can, the concepts I'm giving you allow you to analyze what's going on. It's a tricky kind of story, the Odyssey, which is really, we can easily get swept away in just the kind of enjoyment of the situation and the character and the new adventure that Odysseus is having, or the new engagement with a new character. But to really step back for a second and see some of the structural things going on in this text, whether it has to do with the psychology of the characters, with the specific nature and meaning of the journey, and the meaning of the journey, and so on. this is really crucial to see those kinds of things. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just turn to Blackboard to look at the format here so we can see very clearly what's going on. So you don't have, it's totally unambiguous what you have to do to submit and complete the exam. Okay, so here we see our weekly assignments, and a new one is going to be going up shortly for the next reading. Plato's Apology of Socrates, a really interesting and exciting text, and the concepts. Our remaining texts, let me just mention this now, are going to be the Apology of Socrates. Then we're going to look at Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and then we're going to finish with Othello. And all three of those texts are really connected together, particularly Plato's Cave, the Allegory of the Cave from Plato's Republic, and then Othello. There's some really crucial concepts that come out of Plato's Look at the Cave that will be on display in Shakespeare's Othello. And Othello is going to be really exciting. We're going to have, there will be a little project involving analysis of passages in Othello. And we will be watching the film of Othello, and I'm going to have to think about the best way to get that to you all, if I can do it without you having to pay anything on Amazon to watch it. All right, so just a couple little things here. This is the conclusion of the Odyssey here. I have changed it to 4:19, and everything pertinent to the exam is really to be found in here. I'm in the process of adding a few things which I'll have by the end of the day. Here is the folder containing all the materials for the midterm exam. And just, you notice I put the due date on here just as a reminder so you can have it in your mind very clearly. So we'll click on that. And then you'll see two items here. Two items. And there will be a third, which is, well, I guess this video. That's going to be the third one on there. You can't see it yet because I haven't posted it yet. Anyway, the virtual reality here is confusing me a little bit. Okay, so this is the Word document that you'll use that has the directions and the questions for the exam that you'll use as a template for writing your exam itself. And then this is the Turnitin function here, which allows you basically to upload your document when you're done, and it also scans for combinations of words to other texts and to identify plagiarism and things like that, which I'll just make a few brief notes on later. So let me turn off the edit mode and get a mode that's something like what you should see. But you click on this, view and complete, and then this is really simple. This is just like uploading anything to, like an email attachment and so on and so forth. So you toggle here and you get, you find your name, and then you can type your name in here, or maybe it automatically puts it in there. I haven't tried. And then here you can just put, CMP 2800 midterm exam, just like that. Perfect. And then you've got three options to choose the source from where you've got your file coming from, whether you've got it on Dropbox or Google Drive, or whether you just have it on your computer, what have you. So when you submit it, obviously it gives me a time and a date and time as when you've submitted it, so that it knows that it's on time. And then also, again, it checks for issues of plagiarism. And so this is really pretty simple, and I think it's, I haven't gone through all these steps because I'm not actually submitting something, but I've used this in the past, and some of you probably have as well. This all just speaks, given this whole new format, to getting this done in a timely fashion, so that when you do submit, if you have any kinks or questions about how it's done, to give yourself some leeway there as it gets to Sunday night. Okay, so let's go back and let's open up the exam. And there we go. Everything's working pretty well here. Okay, so here we've got our due date right here. And that's 11:59. That's the deadline. Please make sure you've got your name on it. It's got to be in the form of a Word document. A Word document. So just some basic formatting issues. And, you know, some of these are formalities that are convenience for me, like the font and the spacing and things like that. But of course, font and spacing also get into the length of your answer. And the length of your answer is really part of not just what's being asked in terms of following the P's and Q's of the test, but also in terms of answering these questions within the allotted space you're given and writing in a way, demanding that you write in a way that you can compress everything and condense it in those 2 pages. So obviously it's not going to be stapled. So you're going to have 2 questions that you need to answer. The first is going to be mandatory, and then there's going to be a second question you're going to answer, but you're going to be able to choose from a series of options, right? So you choose from a series of options, but at the end of the day, the first question is the same for everyone. The second question comes from those options, and you only answer 2 questions. There's no extra credit or anything like that. So each answer is going to be 2 pages long, times 2 questions means 4 pages. And 4 pages means 4 pages of answer, not including the question, not including anything but the actual text of your answers. So 2 pages. And it really shouldn't be any more, much more, and it really shouldn't be any much less. So obviously if you go over a few sentences or a few sentences less, no big deal, not an issue, right? But for example, you shouldn't be writing me 4 pages for one answer or 3.5 pages, and you shouldn't be writing 1 page either. If you can't write 2 pages, you haven't put in the effort. If you're writing me 4 pages, either you've put in too much effort or you have just not honed down your answer to the kind of essence of it, right? So your challenge is to answer these questions fully and directly, right? Fully means enough, and directly means focused like a laser on what's actually being asked, and making sure you're only addressing what's exactly or relevant to the questions. So then more in terms of the form of the writing, right? Which is you're writing in sentence paragraph form, you're writing an essay, and the question should be left in the final exam. Again, and I would say while you're working, I would leave both the instructions and the questions in the final exam until you're done, but then please leave the questions there. And when you leave the questions there, leave them above your answer, above your response, as one complete question and then one complete response. Do not intersperse the question throughout your response. However, when you work, when you're doing a draft of the essay, by all means, if I were personally writing this essay, what I would do is take the component parts of the question and use them as an outline, and underneath each part I would answer so that I know what order I'm answering in. That establishes the flow of the essay, and then it also establishes that these paragraphs deal with this part and these paragraphs deal with that part. But then at the end you're just going to delete out the parts of the question and just leave it as one whole question at the beginning, right? I think that's not too complicated, right? So obviously grammatical errors, spelling errors, those should not be an issue. Those need to be corrected. That's part of the grading. And that's part of proofreading. But of course, what I said with quiz 2, that the bigger part of proofreading is really reading for the substance and structure of what you've written. So as we'll see here, the format here is identical to quiz 2. Everything that I said for quiz 2 now applies to the midterm, and it will also apply to the format of the final exam. They're all going to be the same format. It's just that the midterm is longer than quiz number 2. Okay. proofreading, right? What is a sentence and what is a paragraph? A sentence is one coherent thought, and a paragraph is a body of thoughts, aka sentences, that form a larger thought that comes under a certain topic or theme, right? And you know that you should start a new paragraph, not just when you've written 5 sentences and you go, oh, after 5 sentences, I'm supposed to, or something to that effect, I'm supposed to start a new paragraph. Well, really, the paragraph should denote not just a visual break at a certain point, but it should connote that you're moving from one topic to the next. And now I'm on to the next topics, and each sentence represents a series of thoughts with that topic, right? And so, for example, when I read, I'm going to ask myself, what is the theme of this paragraph? Do all these sentences sit together as a coherent theme being addressed? And good writing, that is how good writers think about what they're doing when they do that. And it's something that doesn't happen automatically. It's something that requires thought, requires proofreading, and requires constant revision, right? Proofreading for meaning and intelligibility. Here is a sentence. Does it make sense? If someone else read this, do they understand what I mean? Question. Do I understand what I mean? Right? The basic problem with writing that is not clear, in my opinion, is that if you do not have clear writing because you do not have a clear underlying thought that you're trying to express. This is one of the great challenges of writing. Question, what am I really trying to say? You get an initial idea. You get a sense, oh yeah, this has to do with what we're talking about here, or whatever it is, right? But then the question is, do I really have a complete and coherent thought? After that initial kind of aha moment, you may actually discover you really don't have it quite there. It's lurking. It's lurking, but it has to be thought through carefully to really discern that. And this is really important. When we talk about grammar, we're less talking about grammatical mistakes and things like that, but sentence structure that leads to clear and lucid meaning, right? In this format of writing, a kind of essay format, our goal here is to write as clearly and as directly as possible, right? So that's on the level of the sentence. Then I look at my overall paragraph and I say to myself, does one sentence follow another in a coherent and logical fashion? Does it make sense after having said this, that this is the next remark and the next remark, and that this is the concluding remark? Now, remember what the whole structure is of the exam. First of all, your structure is provided by the questions. And then second, your paragraphs are going to consist of, well, it's kind of duh, but answers that basically establish a thesis. If I say, what is the meaning of the word andra, or man, in the opening lines of the poem of the Odyssey, you're going to say, the meaning of that word is this. And then you're going to expound on that thesis statement. So by answering in that way, you've provided a thesis statement where you're going to do 2 things after that. One, you're going to get into greater specificity, and connected with the greater specificity, you're going to provide examples and interpretation and so on and so forth. Right? This is kind of a dumb question, but it's not a dumb question. Where do your answers come from? Where do your answers come from? Well, they come from 2 places. They come, number 1, from the text, and number 2, from your critical thinking on the text. And of course, all the lectures and all the PowerPoints and the study guides provide is designed to give you kind of handles or grapples on the text to allow you to see things going on in it that are not obvious, that the author themselves obviously doesn't spell out. Themes, key issues, interesting psychological elements, the structure of the journey, things of that sort, right? So one important thing about this essay, and I said it for the quiz number 2, and I'm going to say it again for this because I've had some issues in recent semesters. This exam is about your own understanding of the text. There is to be no secondary literature used outside the materials that I have provided for you. This is not a research paper, a kind of classic undergrad research paper, even master's level, is where, like, here's my thesis statement on subtopic, and I'm going to research into what all the secondary literature says about it, and I'm going to kind of synthesize it, bring it together in a coherent fashion in a paper, right? That is not what you're doing here. What you're doing here is you're being asked questions about the text, and you're forced to find those answers both in the text, but also as a result of your critical and analytical thinking about the text and its meaning, right? Interpretation, in a nutshell. So where is your evidence going to come from? Your evidence is going to come from the text, and your evidence is going to come from your logic in reasoning about the text, in the claims you make about it. Okay, so that's really important, because no literature, no text should be used outside of what I've provided, because I'm interested in your understanding. Okay, so last thing, if we're looking at number 11 here, is the issue of scope. Scope. And scope simply has to do with the parameters of what you're writing as connected with the topic or the theme, right? A topic spells out parameters, which is to say both things that should be said or in the essay, and also things that are not relevant that should not be in the essay. So it actually spells out both in and out of the essay, right? And this is, of course, crucial to writing within the limits of the 2 pages. So it means reading the questions very carefully, because I've asked very specific ones that demand a clear response. And anything that is not directly relevant to the question should not be in your answer, right? That said, let's tie that issue in of scope in with number 12, which is you must cite relevant passages from the text. And if you're citing, that also means you need to paraphrase and interpret them. And you can use your judgment about whether it's more appropriate to paraphrase a source or whether to quote directly based on the demands of your answering. But one thing that's really important as you answer is to stay close as possible to the text. The answers are in the text. You want to avoid making overly broad and overly general claims about the text. You know, so like, Homer was the greatest poet who ever lived in Greece, and he was a blind man whose stories have carried down and given him great fame. And Odysseus is the greatest hero of all the Greeks. And he went on a long journey for 20 years, and it started out in Troy. All right, so those things are all, more or less true. But when we look at the questions, we'll see that they're way too broad and general, and they're not sufficiently pertinent, sufficiently relevant to what's being asked. And that stuff, that kind of stuff ends up being kind of filler. And for this type of writing, maybe if you're writing a true essay, that would not be altogether inappropriate. But in answering test questions, we really want to get as directly as possible, directly involved in the text as quickly as possible, right? And obviously you have to start out with making a general claim to situate the reader, right? The meaning of man in the first opening lines of the poem is this, and you make the most general claim that seems pertinent, but then you get into the nuts and bolts, and then you introduce evidence from the text, examples, going to be really crucial from the text to illustrate why this word means what it means, or examples that illustrate what it means, and so on. Okay, so if there was one weakness from the quiz number 2, I would say it was citing directly from a text and interpreting what had been cited. Really important. Okay, so let's move on to the questions. So here I've given you the opening lines of the poem, right? And essentially what I'm asking you about is 2 things, and they're interconnected. First is the meaning of the word man in the opening lines. And second is the concept of twists and turns. In the Greek word is polytropos. and then to discuss those two words together, right? So there's really three very related questions, but they're definitely distinct. So now I'm going to read here. The first word of the Odyssey is in Greek is andra, derived from the word andros and aner, which means a certain type of man. What is the meaning and significance of this word and the various associations it calls to mind? What type of man is this? Okay, so the first part of this simply asks you to give an understanding of the meaning of the word andra or aner. It's a certain type of man. And there's a whole set of characteristics that come with this type of human being. And I'll just give you a little entryway, which is this is not just a reference to a human being as such. Like we say man, often referring to mankind. Here we're not talking about just the human species. We're talking about a male. And then not only are we talking about a biological male, but we're actually talking about something more than just biology, right? And I'm not going to go into it any more than that. But this is, you might call it a cultural type. It's a male who's been who is developed in a certain way and exhibits certain capacities and abilities and attitudes and so on and so forth that we spent a good bit of time talking about in that lecture. And let me just give you one hint that this type of man is absolutely associated with the concept of a hero. And you might even say that a hero is by definition this type of man. They're almost synonymous. It's a facet of what the hero is. Then, as we've seen in the study guides, that twists and turns is a translation of the Greek word polytropos, right? And this word means many things. And here I'm asking very specifically, as this term, what is the meaning of this word? And there's a whole variety of potential translations. And that whole breadth of translations capture not only different facets of the meaning, but also different aspects of this story. Moving from the psychological aspect of this character, the man who's literally of twists and turns, has to do with something about his identity, his character, his psychology, his nature, right? But then also a term that describes, obviously, the man of twists and turns because his journey has been of twists and turns, and what that means. I don't think I'm saying too much in acknowledging that. And then what do these words mean together? Because put together, this word is really a kind of epithet for Odysseus himself. Odysseus is the man of twists and turns. He is the man of twists and turns. Well, that raises the question of what kind of man is Odysseus? And I would just argue that every time we see him on stage in the Odyssey, he is giving Homer is giving us a facet of his identity that perpetually reveals this man of many twists and turns, and that every situation almost can be understood as indicative or exemplifying these concepts. So then the key thing is, once you have defined these things, you need to provide examples. That's the last part of the question. And the key thing is to explain why this example illustrates the concept. Or what part of the concept does this example illustrate? That is really crucial. Here's a question about Xenia. I'm going to go through it rather quickly. So this is part 2. And you have 2, 3, 4 different questions to choose from. Right? 4 different. You choose uno. You choose one. Okay, questions about Xenia. Right? So, first of all, what is Xenia? What does the word mean? And then I've broken Xenia down into components, parts. Essentially, this first part of the question is about what is Xenia? What does it have to do with exchange? What does it have to do with, and what are the types of things? How is it a form of justice? How does it reveal the nature and character of characters? What is its function and purpose? So on. Then I ask a more specific question, very close to the homework, about why Xenia fails on the island of Polyphemus. And obviously, that has something to do with Odysseus confronting this character Polyphemus, who is of a certain order, a certain type of being that prevents this relationship or this ritual from playing it out in the way we might expect it to in its ideal form. And number 3 deals with Genesis, Book 2, in connection with Milton. And so let's just backtrack. This is kind of a mental journey back a little bit here. Book 2 deals with the picking of the fruit and the significance of that. It spends a lot of time talking about the conversation between the snake and Eve. And of course, it also tells the story of the creation of Adam and Eve the second time, where Adam comes from the dirt and has life breathed into him. And then Eve comes out of his rib, and he has a mate and a wife, and they are married as one flesh. So I think those things are even lurking there in that story, because of how they're made signifies who they are. We've talked about that at great length. And the Milton story, the way I like to think of the Milton story is that he's really not saying anything fundamentally different than the Genesis chapter 2 story. But what he is doing is expanding it out like an accordion. One feature of the Bible in these early tales in the book of Genesis is that the stories are so compressed and so abbreviated. And we've actually seen that in our discussion of Odysseus' Scar, this essay by Eric Auerbach, in which he says, where is the time? Where is the place? What's the situation? What's going on when action is described in the Bible? It's very abrupt, and I like the word, it's clipped. It's abbreviated, and it only gives the kind of very absolute essential facts in order to tell the story. It doesn't paint beautiful pictures like Homer, for example, that seem to actually distract. I mean, Auerbach makes an interesting argument that the description in the Odyssey actually distracts from what's going on in the plot, right? It's like a diversion. Whereas in Genesis, it's totally compressed. So what does Milton do? Basically, I think, how to read a book? Well, you read poetry because it's condensed. There's so much meaning born on the word. And, he says novelist, Joseph Brodsky said novelists are just too loquacious. They're too wordy. They say what poets do in 300 pages, and the poet does it in a short poem. But what Milton does is expand out that story and fills in imaginatively, maybe in a more rich way, what this story looked like if we kind of tried to make it a little more realistic. So I'm asking you to use those in tandem with one another. And that said, this is one instance where a secondary source is appropriate because it's part of our reading, which is Cass. Cass really gives some very interesting insights into this. We've talked about them in class. So what is the meaning and significance of the fruit and picking it from the tree in the garden? So notice I'm making a distinction here between the fruit itself and its meaning, but the picking of the fruit as another element that needs to be understood. What is the fruit literally and figuratively? Right? Literally meaning it's kind of palpable reality, the letter of the word. So, that's kind of obvious. It's a fruit, right? And then its figurative significance, we're talking about its metaphorical or its symbolic significance, right? This story, let's face it, this story is totally incoherent and rather absurd if that fruit does not have a powerful symbolic meaning, right? And that is really the essence of the story, all wrapped up under the guise of this strange Eve figure picking the fruit. Given that the fruit is a symbol for something, what does it mean to eat the fruit? So eating also must be a metaphor. Milton places much significance on the sensual appeal of the fruit to our eyes. So we all remember Milton here. What happens? The serpent speaks to Eve. And we discover after his very long oration, because he's a rhetorician, we discover the whole time he's been speaking into her ear, and it's almost like whispering a kind of seduction in her ear, that all along she's been staring at the fruit with her eyes, and it's appealing to her eyes and her sense of smell, and she's imagining then what it tastes like, right? And so you have these different modes of transmission of information, from speech going in her ear to the more bodily appeal of its appearance, its color, its smell, and its potential taste. And what is the meaning and symbolism of that kind of appeal? How does the serpent speak to Eve? Remember, there were certain adjectives that overlap both in chapter 2 of Genesis, but also in Milton, right? He speaks and acts in a certain way, and one way to identify how he speaks is also how it affects her. The consequence of how she's affected helps illustrate how he speaks. What are the types of things or knowledge he claims the fruit represents? So he gives a kind of very expansive speech on what you're going to get when you eat this fruit. And some of it, most of it is knowledge. In many ways it is very consistent with the Genesis story, because it's a tree of knowledge of a certain kind. But he does directly and indirectly talk about other things that she is going to get from this fruit. And then the question, is he telling the truth? Is he telling the truth? Explain Eve's motives for picking the fruit. And I say plural, motives, because there are multiple motives that we can come up with, and I think they're all relevant. And, I mean, this is a great question that illustrates what the Bible is and how it is to be read. The Bible is a book that demands you ask questions of it. It demands you ask questions. And let me tell you, there's always more than one answer to the same question. And, I mean, Eve has to be a who is Eve? She has to be a representative, in a sense, for all humanity, right? She's not just a modern feminist, right? She represents all humanity. And therefore, there's got to be multiple reasons why she likes the fruit, right? And, of course, that's going to be dependent on how you understand what it is. Both Genesis and Milton emphasize that human beings will become like gods when they eat the fruit. What does it mean to become godlike as understood in the context of the story? Now, of course, we all have, from our just cultural formation, some understanding of like what a god is like, what a hero is like, or some such, right? But I'm speaking very specifically, how is this understood within the context of the story? He says, if you attain these things, you will become like them, to paraphrase. Well, what are those things she will attain that will make her godlike? What does it mean to be a god as understood by the context of the story? Right? God warns that they will die if they eat the fruit. Is this true? This also goes back to whether the serpent is telling the truth. Is this true? Or rather, in what ways is this statement both true and not true? Right? So this enters the question of what does it mean to die here? What kind of death? And maybe when are they going to die? When God first makes the commandment and the threat that's made is that you're going to die, the impression seems clear that this means you're going to die right when you eat it. But of course that doesn't happen. So in that sense, that's simply not true. If in fact we gain knowledge and wisdom from the fruit, why has God prohibited us from the fruit? Now this is a question that is even more challenging, especially to come up with a rational answer. if you're basing your answer on faith here, right? Why has God prohibited us from the fruit? The answer is very simple. Because that is his will, and that is what he wants for us, and therefore, ergo, by default, that is what is best for the human being. But Cass, interestingly, I mean, he is a Jew raised in the Hebrew tradition of the Bible, but when he writes this book, The Beginnings of Wisdom, he says, I'm going to do something that's not entirely appropriate from the point of view of faith. I'm going to approach this text rationally, and I'm going to look for rational explanations and causes as to why. And this is really important for those of you, I think particularly who are not religious, in that Cass points out a rational explanation, even though God doesn't give it, of course. Right? Parents don't always give explanations as to why there is this prohibition. And it's intriguing because this prohibition goes against our whole modern mentality of science, of exploration of the unknown, the general assumption that using our intellect and our reason and our understanding is always going to be beneficial and has no very serious negative consequences or side effects. Okay. So then, last two here. Compare and contrast the Odyssey and the book of Job. In both the Odyssey and the book of Job, we see tragedy befall the central characters. Compare and contrast the nature and causes of the suffering of each, what happens to each and why. Then consider the relationship between the identity of the character to the specific nature and cause of their trials and tribulations. While Job is a blameless man, Odysseus is a man of twists and turns, among other things. So a couple things here. They obviously have some important similarities. They're both being, you could say, tortured by divine beings, right? Compare and contrast the nature of what they go through. Compare the types of things they suffer. Then the cause. What is the cause? On one sense, it is similar. They're both gods, but the cause is also different because of their different characters. So therefore, consider the identity of the character in relationship to the nature and cause. And these are two very different people, and you might call them two very different heroes. I don't think it's hard to look at Job as a certain type of heroic figure. And I think one of the key things I'm thinking about here is that he is much more upright than Odysseus in the way we understand kind of moral virtue. Odysseus is presented as a great man and a hero despite his flaws, or even because of certain shortcomings, or things that we wouldn't consider worthy of respect. This text seems to give respect to. And there's a very different perspective on what constitutes human greatness from one story to the next, and that's intriguing. Compare and contrast how each copes with his misfortunes and what it says about their character. Lastly, compare the role of Satan and Poseidon, and just to state the obvious, they're in a very similar position vis-a-vis the main character in the way in which they're both responsible for carrying out, you could say, the torture, without using the words that really give away what they're doing to the characters. Then the last one deals with Odysseus' journey and his psychology. What is the significance of the passage below, which is, even so, you and your crew may still reach home, suffering all the way, if you only have the power to curb their wild desires and curb your own. So this deals really with the theme of curbing one's desire and the consequences of achieving or failing at that task for the journey itself and what happens on it. What is the significance of this passage to Odysseus as a character, his psychology, his journey, and his process of growth or education from the beginning to the end of the story? How does this passage reveal or characterize the internal struggle between our reason and our passions as human beings? What does it mean to curb one's wild desires? What is the cardinal virtue connected with curbing our desires? What is the relationship between curbing one's desire and getting home to Ithaca for Odysseus and his men? So let's be clear, what's being exhibited in this conflict of curbing one's desire is an entirely internal conflict. If we think of this journey as a physical journey, most of the conflicts to be had appear at first glance to be external conflicts between Odysseus and his men and the beings and people he encounters. It turns out, it seems that the primary conflict in this text is not really one between man and gods. It's not really one between man and other beings. It's really a conflict between man, I would argue primarily a conflict between man and himself, because we've identified that the human soul is divided into factions that war with one another, that put ourselves in conflict with ourselves. And we read this passage from Plato, such that the human being is a puppet pulled by different motivational strings. And we went into a little analysis of the Greek understanding of psychology, the 3 different parts of the soul that pull us in different directions. And we looked at how those are all operative in the various characters. This will also be very important for Othello, because this model of psychology has persisted in literature and our basic understanding of the human being. And it's a kind of basic understanding that it's the kind of coin of the realm when you start thinking about people, whether you're a PhD psychologist or an author or the guy on the street. So an internal conflict seems to constitute the real journey here, the real journey. Okay, so I think that's a pretty comprehensive look at everything here. If you have any questions, please email as soon as possible. If you have any specific concerns about your own, just logistics of your own life circumstance, please get in touch ASAP. Also, again, keep an eye out for materials that will keep going up, and I will send out notices on those. And I wish you all the best of luck, and I'll be getting back on your questions in a timely fashion. Thank you very much, guys.